Okay, so just getting started, just to back up and talk a little bit about some basic rumen physiology. Uh, the rumen is really just a giant fermentation vat. A mature cow capacity will have a neighborhood of 50 gallons of capacity inside the rumen. Um, there's a lot going on there, and really the major fermentation that's going on with the microbes in the rumen are going to be producing volatile fatty acids. And within that, it's a very wet environment, and the microbes are there to break down the fiber component of the diet, and they'll also break down some starches as well, and we'll discuss here shortly. The majority of the VFAs are absorbed in the rumen, and we'll talk about what volatile fatty acids are, or VFAs, here shortly. But it's also important to remember that there's really not any enzymatic digestion that occurs in the rumen. Everything that's going on there is just purely from a fermentation standpoint. One other thing to remember of what's going on in the rumen is there's a production of what's called microbial protein, which we'll get into just a little more detail in a few slides. But what microbial protein is that is the microbes or the bacteria that are in the rumen, and proliferate and grow in the rumen will eventually move on down through the animal's digestive system and actually be digested themselves. And so they provide a lot of the essential amino acids to the ruminant animal, or in this case, we're going to be talking mainly about cows, but it's very similar with any other ruminants. So a lot of the protein that animal needs, it can actually produce itself within the rumen. Now it has additional needs for protein, which we'll discuss, but that flow of microbial protein is really critical to the animal, and makes it very unique, and gives the ruminant animal a lot of advantages. So just moving on our way through the digestive system, we talk about the reticulum. The reticulum is really a pouch at the front of the rumen, is shown here, that aids in rumination. So an animal as they ruminate, the larger particles will move in and out of the reticulum, and once an animal chews that, and it goes back into the rumen. And really, this chewing or this reduction of particle size is really what controls the flow of particles out of the rumen. So the animal needs to break down those particles, make them smaller, so they'll flow out of the rumen and in through the rest of the digestive system. The omasum will be this area here. Any of y'all have had the opportunity to do a necropsy or look in an animal there, that omasum is really hard, and it's probably, well, not quite the size of a volleyball, but probably a little bit bigger than a softball, hard in shape, and it's really important in absorbing a lot of water as it comes out of the rumen, and also volatile fatty acids. Um, there's also what's called with young ruminants, when they're still suckling, there's a reticular groove that's active in the rumen that actually takes milk straight past the rumen into the omasum and then on to the abomasum for digestion. So that's real important in young ruminants. The abomasum is here, what's called the true stomach, and that's really where all the acidic and enzymatic digestion occurs. And digestion occurs there is more like what happens in an animal like humans, or in swine or other animals. That digestion that takes place there is actually very similar. Moving down the digestive tract, going to the small intestine, that's really where all the enzymatic digestion takes place. Again, very similar to humans. And what happens there, a lot of the proteins that the animal consumes, as well as microbial protein, is broken down in the small intestine, and also carbohydrates that would escape ruminal digestion would also be broken down in a rumen just through normal enzymatic breakdown. Again, very similar to what happens in the human digestive system. It's also the major site for nutrient absorption. So really, a lot of the absorption that takes place in nutrients happens right there in the small intestine. Large intestines also evolved to some degree in nutrient absorption, and also a lot of absorption of water back into the system that is all a part of digestion. Okay, any questions on the physiology portion? I know that's a pretty quick run through. We just wanted to give everybody a general idea on that. Any questions? All right, we'll jump on to basic nutritional needs of the animal. These really seem, well, for the most part, pretty obvious, but you've got water, we've got carbohydrates, which really provide the energy. We've got protein. There's a refuge component of the diet that's critical in rumen function, and of course, need fats, minerals, and vitamins. And we're going to touch on each one of these things briefly through the presentation. Obviously, a big one is water. Oftentimes, we take water for granted. Just assume that that the animal's got availability to good, clean water. But it's important to remember that water makes up about 70% of an animal's body weight, and so obviously, it's very critical in any kind of normal function. And if you think about requirements for water, it's really pretty well unrestricted access. And anytime an animal is limited on water intake, their feed intake will also drop. Bottom line being, if there's no water or no feed, and anytime I've seen this in the real world in practice, that if an animal is limited on water, if you see a drop in feed intake, especially with confined animals, the first thing you want to look at is water, because if they're not eating, very likely there's a water issue, whether it's water quality or availability. Animals will drink, mature animal will drink about 12 gallons a day in a more of a temperature neutral environment. When it gets warm, certainly their water needs can double. Water quality is real important as well, and clean intake improves water, or clean water improves water and improves intake of water and feed. And a lot of things can be a problem with water quality. Salinity, pH, sulfates, nitrates, all of these things can decrease your water intake and hurt performance. What I've seen in a lot of different cases is salinity or almost brackish water. There's places in Utah that I know that's a problem. At times, if it's cool, animals can get along fairly well if their water intake isn't very high, even if the water quality is off a little bit. But as soon as it gets warm, it starts to become a problem. So this is something to think about working with water. All right, carbohydrates for the most part, and especially in a beef cow's diet, are coming from grass, and we're looking at plant cell walls. That's a fiber component. Plant cell walls make up all the structure of the plant itself, made up of several different things, would be lignin, cellulose, and hemicellulose. Lignin is largely indigestible, and it's, warm season plants tend to accumulate lignin more rapidly than cool season plants do. So generally speaking, your cool season plants will be a little higher in quality because the lignin content tends to be a little bit lower. That's also true as plants get more mature, their lignin content also increases. So your dormant, dry, even cool season plants will have a higher lignin content. Cellulose is pretty well broken down by microbial enzymes in the rumen, and obviously, cellulose really isn't digested by monogastrics at all. Hemicellulose is more easily broken down by ruminants as well. And as I mentioned earlier, the bottom line is as plant maturity increases, your fiber content increases and digestibility goes down. Other non-structural plant cell contents would include starches and sugars, which can definitely serve as an energy component for ruminants. So talking a little bit about digestion, about 70 to 90% of the digestion takes place in the rumen. And that is, again, with microbial digestion. There's both starch digesting and fiber digesting microbes in the rumen, and the amount of those two, the relative volume of those two microbes really depend on the animal's diet. So as an animal switches from a fiber diet into a higher starch diet, like you might see in the feed yard, it actually takes time for the microbes to adjust and to build up with larger volumes of starch digesting microbes. That's why at times you can see a bloat or digestive issues with cattle or sheep, either one, whose diet changes abruptly, is because there's time for these microbes to be able to adapt. Products, some of the products of carbohydrate digestion, we've talked about microbial flow, very important to the animal's overall system as these microbial cells flow through the system and are digested. Really important part in it. It's mainly protein that comes there, and a lot of the amino acids that are essential for the animal to get along well come from that microbial flow. There's also volatile fatty acids, and that's really the major energy component that the animal utilizes. Is the fiber and the other things broken down in the rumen are the microbes produce volatile fatty acids, and that's the principal source of energy in a ruminant, and that's also primarily absorbed in the rumen. And then you've got the gas component and also heat, gas being methane, carbon dioxide. And then anytime there's any kind of fermentation, you get heat. And so your higher fiber diets will produce more heat than a higher concentrate or higher grain diet. Another thing to keep in mind, that if an animal is in really cold weather, a lot of times you can, and if they're on a higher concentrated diet, you can actually increase their heat increment and how much heat they get from the rumen by increasing the roughage content. All right, so we'll talk a little bit about protein. Proteins are made up of amino acid chains, and essentially amino acids are amino acids an animal cannot produce for themselves. And so the sources of the essential amino acids are the diet, and as we've mentioned, microbial protein. Now, generally speaking, microbial protein can go a long ways to keep an animal healthy, or not healthy, but keep an animal alive, moving them forward. But when we're really looking at higher production, and when an animal is in a higher production portion of their life, they do need additional protein in their diet, which we'll talk about protein supplementation here shortly. The amino acids are primarily absorbed in the small intestine. And it's important to remember that all amino acids contain nitrogen, and we'll talk about that relative to the use of non-protein nitrogen in the diet. But all of your amino acids and protein in general, nitrogen is a basic building block. So the important thing about rumen microbes is they can utilize just nitrogen to make microbial protein. And so that allows us to be able to feed non-protein nitrogen, which is often going to be in the form of urea, to a ruminant animal, and with that, and with additional energy in the diet, they can produce more microbial protein and get along fairly well with the use of non-protein nitrogen or urea as a protein supplement. Now that has some limitations, and in most cases it can't be the only source of protein in their diet, but it can be a source of protein in a supplement that can oftentimes be much more economical and easier to provide. So that's an important factor. All right, so microbial activity again breaks down a lot of the protein in a rumen. So you get nitrogen and amino acids that are utilized by rumen microbes, and those microbes grow and proliferate in the rumen. Excuse me. But the amino acid composition in the small intestine, the amino acid that actually makes it to the animal for them to be able to absorb themselves, really doesn't change much. Once that protein goes into the animal, the microbes will utilize it, and so that amino acid composition get along to the rumen doesn't change a whole lot, really, regardless of what protein is being provided to the animal. So some of the sources of essential amino acids, we talked about microbial protein, but once again, in and of itself, microbial protein doesn't meet the higher demands of high production. So we do need dietary protein that escapes the rumen and goes on for digestion in the small intestine. Would be referred to as bypass proteins. And there's also different types of amino acids that can be supplied to the diet, which would be a protected amino acid. Those are specific amino acids that make it through the rumen and onto the small intestine. You mostly see this in dairy diets. Generally speaking, the effect of protected amino acids in beef diets are hard to measure, but in high producing dairy cows, amino acids that we can move on through to the small intestine can make a big difference in production. Okay, maybe I'll stop there real quick and see if anybody's got any questions on proteins or carbohydrates. All right, Fats also play a component in a ruminant diet, although we don't feed a lot of fat, but there's fat in really all forages and grains. There's always a small amount of fat. You also can look at added fats to the diet in terms of vegetable oils. They can be in corn oil, soy, canola, palm, and cottonseed. And oftentimes we see fat in ruminant diets in the form of byproducts from a lot of these feeds. Well, corn, you would have a corn distiller's grain would be relatively high in fat. Soybean meal, canola meal, palm oil, or cottonseed meal, which are high protein products, also have relatively high levels of fat. We can also feed animal fats, whether they're pork or tallow, back to ruminants, and they can digest really a relatively small amount of that. If we add too much fat back to the diet, it can inhibit fiber digestion in the rumen. So that's not something that we want to do. But small amounts of fat can bypass the rumen and be digested in the small intestine and be helpful. Again, primarily these fats are absorbed in the small intestine. And really the role that they play in a diet is to increase diet energy and also reduce heat and gas loss. For the most part, we see a lot of added fats in feedlot or dairy diets, but I've seen a lot of a benefit come from adding fat or really adding some byproduct feeds that are higher in fat in a beef cow diet and do add a lot of energy to the diet. So it can be pretty helpful. So we're going to hit some of the macro and trace minerals fairly quickly. You could spend several hours talking about this, which I won't put all of you through that. But I just want to hit some of the major macro and trace minerals. First of all, salt. I think everybody knows really that most all animals need salt. And it's really important to remember that it's really the only mineral that cattle will seek out, that they will go and find salt to eat. Really, the other minerals, there's been a lot of work done over the years trying to look and see if cattle are deficient, will they go seek out calcium or phosphorus or magnesium or whatever it might be? And generally speaking, they don't. But they will seek out salt. And it's important to really have salt in front of cattle at all times. Calcium is obviously important in the diet, and it's pretty high in forages. And so generally speaking, the cattle on forage diets don't need to be supplemented with much calcium. But in a feedlot, we do add a fair amount of feedlot and dairy. We do add a fair amount of calcium if they're on a higher concentrate or higher grain diet. Phosphorus is high in grain, so not much need to supplement that in a dairy or feedlot, but with dormant forages, particularly from dormant forages, we'll supplement phosphorus. And again, phosphorus is also pretty high in really lush forages, but when we've got cattle grazing winter forage or low quality forage, added phosphorus is really critical for optimal production. Magnesium is generally adequate in most forages, but we can see problems with magnesium with really lush forages early in the spring. It can produce a problem called grass tetany. So oftentimes the cattle, particularly stocker cattle, but I've seen it with cows as well, are on really lush forages. There's some need to add some magnesium to the diet. Potassium, somewhat like phosphorus, may need to be added when you're feeding low quality forages or when animals are on a dormant range type diet. Phosphorus being a lot more important to optimal production, but potassium is certainly important as well. The last one there is sulfur. It isn't very often that we need to supplement sulfur, but it's important to be aware of it because excessive sulfur can actually negatively affect digestion in the rumen and also affect the absorption of copper and zinc and some other trace minerals that are really critical. And typically the sources of high sulfur are going to be water, and then there are some feeds such as distiller's grains, which are pretty high in sulfur. Typically at a normal supplementation level, the distiller's grains aren't going to be a problem with sulfur unless it's adding to a problem that's already there, being in the water, for example. All right, trace minerals, and these are usually, most of these trace minerals would be usually deficient in one form or another, and oftentimes require supplementation for optimal production. There's lots of different forms of trace minerals. Generally speaking, your sulfate forms, copper sulfate, zinc sulfate, are more readily absorbed than the oxide forms of these trace minerals. So if you're working with a producer or you can see that what they're feeding is a lot of copper oxide, zinc oxide. Those are typically not real readily available. Your sulfate forms are more so. From there, you're looking at some sort of organic or chelated source of trace minerals, and oftentimes when we're looking at supplementing a fairly significant trace mineral problem, we're going to want to resort to that. And these forms are more easily absorbed in the animal, and they're also not as susceptible to antagonists that might be available in the diet. Generally speaking, copper obviously is really critical to overall performance, health, growth, reproduction. Um, there are certain other minerals and trace minerals that can be antagonistic to copper absorption if there's high molybdenum in the area, or iron or sulfur. These are things you can find out from doing some testing, forage and water testing. Cobalt. This is one that we didn't talk about much 20 or 30 years ago, but I found that it can be helpful to, in the last several decades, it can be really helpful to production to add some cobalt to the diet. It's really integral to vitamin B12 and overall energy metabolism. Iodine, important for thyroid function and hoof health. Important to remember with iodine is at really high levels, it can be toxic. But it definitely can make a difference in hoof health if you're having some hoof problems. Manganese, a cofactor in a lot of metabolic processes and enzyme function. You got selenium, which is important in muscle growth and fertility. And then zinc, very integral in the immune system and also been linked to hoof health along with iodine. Okay, just quickly on vitamins. And generally speaking, most of your vitamins will need to be supplemented. Vitamin A is real important in bone and tissue growth and eyesight. Typically, if you're looking at a diet where you're supplementing all the vitamin A, you're looking at about 30,000 international units per head per day. Vitamin D can be synthesized by the skin with sunshine, and it's really important in bone formation, calcium mobilization in the bone. So typically, we will supplement that. You'll see in a lot of trace mineral mixes. Vitamin E, a lot of work done in that area looking at the effect of vitamin E on health and immune function. Most animals will need in the neighborhood of about 100 units a day. But if you've got calves or any animals that you are going to be in a high stress situation, you want to add more towards the upper end of the vitamin E threshold, 400 units a day or so. Probably too expensive to supplement that much in a cow herd, but with calves, it can definitely make a difference. And then thiamine is real important to central nervous system and development and function. And normally, cattle will produce plenty of thiamine on forage diets, but feedlot cattle can become deficient. And if they do, you can see a lot of problems in the feedlot with thiamine. Also, they might be referred to as brainers because the cattle have a lot of central nervous systems and they'll stumble around in the feed yard if they're thiamine deficient. Okay, just real quick, that's a kind of a wrap up on the general nutrients or the animal's needs in terms of nutrients. Any questions on that piece? Okay, well, we'll jump in a little bit and talk about dry matter intake. When we talk about feed intake, you usually want to think about it in terms of on a dry matter basis, meaning that water content of feed does provide some obviously water to the animal system, but really doesn't provide any nutritive value. So if an animal is eating a feed such as corn silage that is pretty high in moisture, typically about 35% dry matter in corn silage, they've got to eat a lot more of it to get the same amount of actual dry matter intake than if they were feeding hay. So the example I have here is if an animal is eating 50 pounds of corn silage at 35% dry matter, they're eating about 17.5% dry matter. At the same time, if an animal is eating 20 pounds of hay at 88% dry matter, they would be eating 17.6% pounds of dry matter, or really the equivalent amount of feed. So This seems rather obvious, but it's really important to remember that as we're looking at formulating diets. The water content is really, really critical. Oftentimes we talk about intake on an as-fed basis, but when you're looking at differences in moisture, that could make a big difference, and you want to look at things on a dry matter basis. Oftentimes you can look at trying to predict dry matter intake as looking at intake as a percentage of the animal's body weight. This is true for a cow. It's also true in a feed yard setting. So typically we'd be looking, say, a 1,200-pound cow is going to eat about 2.5% of her body weight, or 30 pounds of dry matter. There's a lot of things that control that, which we'll talk about here shortly. In addition to the size of the animals, also the quality of the diet. But generally speaking, this is a good way to think about intake. And when we want to try to help somebody figure out how much those cows are going to eat, this is a pretty good rule of thumb. I'll give you a little more information here in just a minute. So some of the factors affecting dry matter intake are obviously the body weight of the animal. Larger animals are going to eat more. That's intuitive. Also body condition of the animal. A thinner animal, an animal that is carrying the frame of say a 1,200-pound animal, but only weighs 1,000 pounds because they're not in good condition, they're going to eat more like a 1,200-pounder. So if you're looking at an animal that's thinner, but it's got a large frame, you're going to want to look at that and compensate for that a little bit when we're trying to predict dry matter intake. Also, the stage and level of production. Higher energy demands typically will increase dry matter intake, such as pregnancy, but also important to remember that the late stages of pregnancy, when a calf is really large, the cow might have a harder time actually physically eating as much because the calf might be impeding on the rumen volume. But generally speaking, if they're in lactation or other higher energy demands, their intake will go up. Forage quality is a really big factor, along with body weight, in determining how much an animal will eat. Low quality forage, which is lower digestibility, reduces feed intake. And that's really a factor of how long that feed stays in the rumen before it breaks down enough to be able to pass on from the rumen and through the omasum and into the abomasum. The particle size is really what controls the outflow of the rumen. So if there's the feed the animal is eating is not breaking down into a small particle size, the retention time in the rumen is going to be a long time, and that animal won't be able to eat more. We're going to talk a little bit more about what that means here shortly. The other thing that will affect dry matter intake is supplementation. Protein supplementation can improve intake of low quality forage, meaning that if you balance that animal's diet for protein, you give the microbes in the rumen all the nitrogen and protein they need to be for optimal digestion. Digestion improves, and therefore intake improves. So one real basic tenet of when we're looking at cow supplementation is to increase protein content so the cows can eat more, and thereby they get increased energy as well. If we're just supplementing for energy, for example, and we're feeding a high energy supplement, their intake of forage can actually reduce, which may be the goal, maybe what you're trying to accomplish. But if you're not wanting to reduce forage intake, we need to be a little bit careful about how much energy supplement we add to the diet. So some other factors affecting dry matter intake, one would be environment. When cattle are in extreme heat, their dry matter intake will decrease, whether it's they just want to stand in the shade and don't want to go eat. Also a matter of the heat that comes from fermentation makes them want to back off and not eat as much. I've also seen cold increase dry matter intake to a point, but I've also seen situations where cold and wind can cause cattle to eat less. I took this picture last January in Kansas. The cattle in the picture are Brahman influenced cattle, are not really happy about the current weather conditions that they are experiencing. This was a blizzard that was whiteout conditions, and then it got real cold afterward. And it was interesting to watch cattle in a feed yard they'd been through a real extreme cold and then had been below zero for a period of time with a lot of wind. That rather than eating, which you'd think they'd want to do, they would just stand up, they would just bunch up and not with their tails to the wind and not eat at all, or eat very little. So it's, the environmental factors are always a big factor in what animals will eat. We need to be aware of that. Some other physical metabolic factors, really two things, in addition to the environment, but two things affect cattle intake. One is whether they're physically full, and cattle can become full, as we discussed earlier, with, like, say, a high forage diet, even if their energy requirements are not being met. And that's in the case of if they're eating low quality forages and it slows down the rate of passage. The other factor that can affect intake are metabolic factors, which really a matter of the energy, the blood level of energy, and the production of VFAs that get converted to glucose. Just like you and I, if you eat a really high energy dense diet, you're not going to eat as much. And so what we see, oftentimes in a range situation, is that with cows, is that rumen fill is oftentimes what is controlling feed intake, as opposed to in a feedlot situation where it's actually energy level of the diet that increases feed intake. The cattle are probably not actually physically as full as they could be, oftentimes in the feed yard, as opposed to cattle that are out on range. You also see cattle, if they're eating really high energy grass, say crested wheat early in the spring, or wheat, that they're actually getting high enough energy levels that they're not physically full at that point in time either. So I like this graph because it kind of demonstrates what the effect of the energy level of the diet is on intake. So looking at the kind of left part of this graph, in lower energy diets with the TDN levels in the 50s and 60s, you've got rumen fill that's controlling dry matter intake. When those animals are kind of in this portion, when their energy level, this is an energy maintenance here, and then we've got TDN numbers here. But oftentimes we think of TDN, or total digestible nutrients, when we're thinking about cow diets. And when we're looking at in lower levels here, their intake is controlled by that animal actually being full. And then as we move to the right on this scale with higher energy diets, you've got kind of a maximum of feed intake, probably occurring between 65 and 75% TDN would be right in here. But as the energy level of the diet goes up, you'll start to see the energy level controlling intake rather than gut fill, or the metabolic factors. And so again, as we're looking at how much we think cattle will eat, whether they're in a confined setting in a feed yard, or if they're out on range, or consuming hay, this is a huge factor in how much we can get them to eat. All right, questions on dry matter intake. That's a real important factor. Anybody? All right, we'll talk a little bit about nutrient requirements, and then some supplement considerations. So one thing important to remember is a priority of nutrient use. And as an animal is taking in nutrients, the first thing that those nutrients will go is to supply that animal's need to maintain their body. So, for their heart to pump, for all their organs to function normally, the energy, the protein, and all the other nutrients that they take in are going to go to that maintenance first. And then secondly, if you've got energy in excess of maintenance, it'll go to some level of activity for them to walk around or whatever it might be. And then secondly would be pregnancy maintenance, or if that animal's already pregnant, she's going to shunt all the energy, all the maintenance, all of the nutrients she can after she satisfies these first two needs to maintain that pregnancy. It takes a lot for an animal to lose a pregnancy due to nutritional value once they're pregnant, or nutritional problems once they're pregnant. It can certainly happen, but it takes a lot. From that point, we've got lactation. A cow will give all the milk she can to that calf once she meets the needs of these first three, and then on to growth. So in the case, say, of a first calf heifer that she's still growing, she'll lactate all she can at the expense of growth, if she doesn't have enough nutrients to sustain all of these priorities. Then from there, the growth will be energy reserves. So Cattle really don't put on any fat. For example, a cow's not going to get fat until she fills all these other requirements first. And one thing that's important to remember here is way down at the bottom is the estrus cycle. And so if we're trying to get cows in shape to be able to breed, she's got to be able to fill all of these requirements before she's actually get to the point where she can cycle and get bred again. So as we look at satisfying the needs of a beef cow, it's important that we look at, and we want to be able to get her bred every year. It's important that we look at satisfying all of these nutrient demands. And then lastly is any kind of external fat that they might put on, or fat stores on the external part of the body. Okay, so some considerations for cows, and I like to look at things kind of in four general stages of production. There's a lot of different ways to look at this, but this is kind of the way I like to. Is we'll talk about period 1, which would be from calving to bull turnout. That's roughly an 80-day time period. The cow, from the day she calves until she needs to get bred again, is about 80 days if she is going to calve on a 12-month interval. Beyond that, period 2 would be from breeding or breeding time, and she's breeding and lactating. That'd be another 125 days. And then period 3, this is the time that when the cow is pregnant, she's no longer lactating, or it's post-weaning. We pulled the calf off, and she's got about 100 days in this time. And then period 4 would be the time just before calving, when her energy demands start to go up, her protein demands start to go up because of the growth of that calf. So some questions to answer for that each stage as we think through cow production is, what is the forage quality in terms of TDN, crude protein? And it's good to get estimates on forage tests to get a good idea of what that is, if that's possible. And then also, as we talked earlier, is expected dry matter intake. Based on the cow size, her condition, and the forage quality, how much do we expect her to eat? And we're going to need to know that to understand how much of this forage is she eating, and so how much does that leave her deficient, if any, for both crude protein and energy, as well as the other nutrients. So just looking at forage quality effect on dry matter intake, this just gives you a general idea as dry matter intake represented here with the line. We've got an animal's percentage of body weight on the left axis. Then across the bottom, we've got the TDN of the diet. And generally speaking, as the TDN increases, and this is not perfectly linear, but it's good for demonstration purposes, as the animals as the energy level of the TDN of the forage is improving, or their overall diet, the energy or their intake will increase. And this is kind of in a tabular form here. We can see the animals at 42% of their, or 42% TDN will eat about a little over 1.5% of their body weight. We get up to 67, and she's eating, 2.35. So to give you an idea what that means, barley straw is going to be around 41% TDN, just down here at the bottom. Whereas crested wheatgrass in the early spring is going to be about 75% TDN. So she's going to eat quite a bit of that. And in fact, she might even get to the point where it's a metabolic feedback that controls her feed intake rather than ruminant fill. So just to throw an example up there, a cow, that 1,100-pound cow eating a 52% TDN, hay is going to eat about 1,100 or 1.8% of her body weight, or a little over 20 pounds, 20 and a half pounds of dry matter intake. So as we're thinking kind of through a typical spring calving energy and protein balance, the brown bars here represent TDN. The lighter kind of yellow bars would represent protein requirements, and the lines here, our brown bar represents TDN intake, and then the kind of greenish bar would represent the protein intake. So you can see, and this is just a rough idea of what an annual cycle is, but generally speaking, in the spring, if this cow's calving in April and May, and she's grazing native range, very possibly she's going to be deficient. Um, Her requirements for particularly for energy, and in this case protein, are going to exceed what the forage is giving her. As we get on in later into the year, the forage quality, the cow's requirements drop, and the forage quality sustains for a period of time to where when you're at, both the energy and protein here, where you're looking kind of in the middle of her production cycle, that would be kind of akin to period 2 on into period 3. The forage is giving her ample protein and energy, and supplementation is likely not needed. When we get out here later in the fall, then especially as we get closer to calving, we're going to have, you can see a protein deficiency starting to occur here later fall, early winter, that works on through the spring, and then also energy kind of follows suit. So obviously, any specific situation is not going to look exactly like this, but it's important to keep this kind of an annual production cycle in mind when we're thinking about the cow's protein and energy needs. So I guess stop real quick. Any questions with regard to that? We're going to work through maybe some scenarios here, but questions or comments? All right. Some supplementation considerations. So when we're thinking about protein being deficient, protein supplement will improve fiber digestion. That's a real important key. And thereby it's going to improve dry matter intake, which will also increase energy intake. So oftentimes in a kind of a practical setting with cow-calf operations, if they're deficient protein, a little bit added protein will not only help the animal protein wise, but also improve energy intake. So really solving two problems at once. And that's kind of the wonderful effect of the ruminant animal. They're able to do that. So as we think a little bit about period 1, which again is calving to bull turnout, it's pretty tough to maintain body condition at this time. And supplementation early in this period can reduce the impact of body condition loss, and can help with the positive energy balance going into breeding. But what's really critical here is to have a cow that calves in good body condition, where she's got some fat reserves to rely on. And if that's the case, then oftentimes that cow can get along on those fat reserves if she's in good shape, to keep her in good enough condition to be prepared to breed. But this is a real critical point in production. Period 2, breeding from lactating. As I kind of showed you in the graph earlier, that there's typically going to be excess energy and protein available for any kind of weight loss that may have occurred during period 1 if it's not overly excessive. And then oftentimes a little protein supplementation towards the end of this period, as the protein of the forage tends to go down with maturity, can improve body condition going into winter and increase intake. But typically in a range environment, these cows are out on range. Supplementing them is difficult. I wouldn't say it's not possible, but it can be pretty difficult. And typically your grass conditions are going to take care of you pretty well during this time. And again, I'll point out that the key is that we have these cows in shape when they calve. So they're not starting behind from an energy and protein standpoint. They're not starting behind as soon as they calve. They've got some fat reserves to rely on. Period 3, animals pregnant, not lactating. These are the times of the lowest maintenance requirements of the year. Great time to add weight, especially early in that period. Oftentimes a little bit of protein if the animals are grazing native range, or even any kind of lower quality forage. A little bit of added protein during this period can really pay off and allow that animal to put on some energy reserves in the form of fat and be prepared going into more difficult times. And in the last period, 60 days before calving, the nutritional demands go up. And really, it's very difficult to add much condition on an animal then. We hope we're in a position just to maintain body condition. So if they put on good fat stores in period 3, when it's pretty easy to do so, in period 4, if you can maintain that body condition, they're likely going to need some protein and energy to do that, depending on what your range conditions or feeding conditions are. But if you can maintain during that time, you'd be doing well. That's why it's so critical to make sure animals are in shape during this period 3. That's the best time to do it. And I kind of look at that as money in the bank in terms of fat reserves as that animal goes into higher producing time in their production cycle. Any questions on that piece? Anybody? Okay, so a little bit more about protein supplementation. We've talked about non-protein nitrogen or NPN. Urea or NPN is considered to be 287% protein. So you could ask yourself, how could something be more than 100% protein? Protein is just measured by just the pure nitrogen content. And so where urea is basically just two nitrogen molecules hooked together, that equates out to a little higher crude protein level than just regular protein does. So this can be a great and economical way to supplement some protein in an animal's diet, because that nitrogen can be utilized by ruminant microbes. There's also a product similar to urea called biuret. You might see that in some supplements that producers might use. And the biuret is really two urea molecules hooked together. The advantage of that is it's a slower release in the rumen, meaning that it takes a little bit of time for those nitrogen molecules to be liberated and to be free nitrogen in the rumen, and that helps with overall digestion. So urea is helpful. A biuret can actually work a little bit better. But I think it's important to remember you can be used on a limited basis with low quality forages. I think it works really good in period 3. There's some products out there that are fairly high in NPN that I think can work good during this time. The key being that, one, the animal's nutrient requirements aren't super high, and also that there's high enough quality in the forage or enough available energy to be able to utilize this nitrogen in the rumen. Generally speaking, I think it's best to use NPN in conjunction with natural proteins. That's going to really be your safest bet. So to utilize some NPN as their protein source, combine it with some natural proteins, you really can have your bases covered pretty well, and also cheapen the cost of a protein supplement. A lot of your natural protein sources, just to give you some example, we've got soybean meal, cottonseed meal, canola. Those are all pretty high, would be in the neighborhood of 40% protein. Your distiller's grains would be in the neighborhood of 30. Meal run or wheat byproduct, in some parts of the country called wheat mids, would be a lower level protein, but still pretty high at 20%. And then, what's often a good protein supplement in this part of the world, if the price is right, would be alfalfa hay, which certainly can be lower than this and sometimes higher, but in the neighborhood of about 20% crude protein. As you're thinking through what your best options are, you want to look at the cost per unit of protein, or look at the dollars per percentage of protein to compare the different values that you get here, and to determine what the animal's protein needs might be. As you're thinking through a supplement, for example, if you've got a situation where the cows really don't need much added energy in their diet, that they can get all that from the forage, you're probably better off going with a higher protein supplement. If they need a little bit of added energy along with the protein, then a lower protein supplement can oftentimes be better. You're actually going to displace a little bit of forage intake. So it just kind of a little bit depends on your goals. So some forms of protein supplement. I'm certainly not advocating any brands here. I just want to use these as examples. But you've got more of a molasses-based lick tub. This would be an example of that kind of a tub here. The cattle are typically going to lick that tub. They can't bite it or eat it. Usually these contain some NPN and some natural protein both. There's some advantages to them. One, you can control intakes pretty well, because that cooked molasses is fairly hard and will slow down consumption, and sometimes you want to be able to do that. It serves mainly as a protein source. They're not going to eat enough to get much energy out of it. Certainly a lot of these products will include vitamins and minerals, which can be very helpful, and you don't need to supplement them otherwise. Another advantage to these lick tubs is they can enhance grazing behavior, meaning that if those tubs you can move the tubs around to get the cows to graze where you want them to, and you're not disrupting their daily behavior by going out and feeding them on a daily or every other day basis. Um, if you want those cows to spread out and to utilize the available forage, these can be a pretty good way to go. They're pretty easy to feed. You don't need a lot of special equipment. Just throw a few back on the back of a pickup, um, and go out and put them where you want them. They can be pretty expensive. This is some of the more expensive forms of protein, but also the ability to feed them is pretty low labor way to feed. So you kind of balance out some of the expense with some of the savings that you get in terms of maintaining animal grazing behavior and also the low labor required to implement that kind of a protein supplementation program. Other would be protein blocks. Normally, these are a little higher in levels of natural protein, but a lot of them do contain NPN as well. Intakes can be sometimes difficult to control because these can be pretty soft, and it just kind of depends on your grazing conditions. But I've seen cows really eat a lot of these at times, and then sometimes not. Sometimes they'll just kind of eat the amount that you want them to eat. They're mainly a protein source, but if animals are eating a lot of them, they're getting some energy out of it too. It's probably a pretty expensive way to eat to supplement energy. And I would say, generally speaking, if your intakes on these blocks are really, really high, the cattle may not have enough available forage. These also can include vitamins and trace minerals. They give you the same advantage of grazing behavior that the blocks do. They're easy to feed. They're fairly expensive, although tend to be cheaper than your lick tubs. And again, the labor can be relatively low as well, depending on how often you need to put them out. Other forms would be kind of a loose meal. I used a brand name there because it's a product that I know about. I'm not advocating it, but one way or another. But a product that's I've seen that's called Roughage Buster. I believe it's made by ADM. I've seen that kind of a product work fairly good. It's going to be pretty similar in nutritional composition to the lick tubs. Um, a lot of them will have some intake control inhibitors that can make your intake a little easier to control. They tend not to overeat them pretty well. Those types of products will often contain vitamins and trace minerals. You do get good grazing behavior. It makes the cattle spread out, easy to feed, low labor, and they can also be very expensive. So again, you're looking at it trading off the expense with some of the conveniences and lower cost to be able to feed them. But that the loose meals are certainly an option. Another one would be some kind of commodity mix, which is going to be a mix of several commodities listed above. I've seen that, usually they're going to be kind of an all natural protein. Could be small pellets or in a meal form. You can actually feed them on the ground. I've seen it done a lot. You're going to need to figure in some waste there, but waste is really relatively small because cattle will pick them up off the ground, especially if it's dry. If you're dealing with a lot of snow on the ground or really wet conditions, certainly this can be more problematic. You need to feed them on a regular basis. So as opposed to the meals or this kind of a loose meal or the tubs and blocks, you're going to want to feed them more often. I'm going to say roughly 3 times a week. They don't necessarily need to fed every day. But you're going to need to be able to feed them enough that the animals have access to them on a fairly regular basis. You may, in some cases, need some kind of special equipment to feed them, unless they're bagged. If it's bagged, they're a little more labor intensive, but they can be fed from a pickup or other a tractor or whatever it might be. Some of the downside is they can be disruptive of grazing behavior. You can find out your cows are standing around waiting for you to supplement them. Or when you do supplement them, they're going to come running in from wherever they might be to get the supplement. And you may not want to disturb their behavior. I've seen this really be problematic when cows have small calves on them and they'll run off and leave their calves looking for that supplemental feed. A little higher labor here, which is offset to some degree by the fact that they're going to tend to be a little bit cheaper. And so, you've got pluses and minuses there. One thing you don't see a lot of in this part of the country would be similar to your commodity mixes, which is what we call a range cube or cake. I've seen it some here in the West, really, really used a lot in the central part of the country. Similar to the commodity mixes, there'll be a mix of a lot of natural protein and sometimes energy sources. They can have some NPN. The nice thing about them is a couple of things. One, you can get them made in a wide range of protein and energy content, depending on what you need. This large cube or pellet reduces waste. You don't have a lot of meal and waste on the ground. They do need to be fed on a fairly regular basis, so roughly 3 times a week. Oftentimes you'll need some kind of special equipment or need to be fed in a bag. They can, just like the meals, they can disrupt grazing behavior. There's a lot of labor involved in feeding them on a regular basis, but it can also be a lot less expensive than the tubs or the blocks. And then what we see a lot in this part of the world, which is a good old reliable source of protein and energy supplementation, and that's alfalfa A. Oftentimes can be a cheaper way to go. They need to be fed on a regular basis. Again, 3 times a week. If it's feeding as a protein supplement, if really we're supplementing energy as well, feeding every day is probably the best way to go. But if you want cattle to utilize some standing forage, you can feed hay 2 or 3 times a week as a protein supplement and get those cattle to spread out and utilize the forage as well. It can be disruptive with grazing behavior, as mentioned. Takes a lot of labor at times to feed them, but oftentimes here in the West, that may be your lowest cost per unit of protein. So I would say in this part of the country that although it may not always be the best answer, it's always something. Alfalfa hay should always be figured in on as a potential for protein and energy supplementation. Again, as you weigh out the labor side with the cost and of the protein, that all has to be weighed out. Okay, questions on protein supplementation. Okay, when it comes to supplementing energy in the diet, really energy we're looking at supplementing or replacing grazing. You know, if we're on a full feed situation, the cattle aren't grazing anything, then everything you're giving them in terms of hay or whatever it might be is your energy supplement. Or you may be supplementing some grazing as well. But in any event, when we're supplying energy to the animal, we are going to be taking away from replacing some grazing, which may be our goal. But if it's not your goal, then we need to kind of re-examine how we want to try to get supplement to them. It's important to test your forages for nutritional value. Range varies widely, not only in protein value, but also in the TDN or net energy maintenance value for the forage. Obviously, if we're feeding a lot of forage, it's going to disrupt grazing behavior, but that may be what you want to do. Labor intensive, a lot of different types of hay can be fed that vary in quality and price depending on the year and your location. But we've got alfalfa grass, a lot of small grains hays are becoming more and more popular. And then obviously you can feed straw as well, depending on the animal's energy requirements. In some situations, you may have some producers that are feeding silage, corn silage, and also small grain silage or sorghum silage can be fed as well. All right, getting on to mineral. Salt blocks, you can feed obviously unfortified salt only, which you see done. Then you've got some fortified salt looking like something like this, contains some trace minerals and vitamins. Usually there's not much for macro minerals in these, be it calcium, phosphorus, magnesium. Typically you're just looking at salt and some trace minerals and vitamins. These are pretty easy to put out. They're fairly inexpensive and may be very adequate when you've got high quality forage. So although these don't supply a lot more than salt, in some cases, particularly in a summer range environment when forage is good, that may be all they need. And so that can be a good way to go. There's also loose mineral supplements, going to come in a bag, look something like this. You've got typically have a more complete mineral and trace mineral supplement. You're going to have some of your macro minerals in terms of calcium, phosphorus, magnesium are going to be at higher levels in these. There's a lot of flexible formulation to fit your needs. So what might be a good mineral in the fall, you might want to feed something a little different through the winter or early in the spring. But typically these formulations will vary. You can buy commercially available supplements to fit the need depending on the time of year. You need to monitor intake on them. In some cases, cows can really overconsume on them. And so depending on the consumption, our producers want to be able to get the right amount in them and try to control that consumption really more than anything by availability. They don't necessarily have to have it every day. If they're eating their week's worth of mineral in 4 days, I'd probably still put out mineral every week, for example. A little more labor to put them out than it does the salt blocks because it's got to be put out more often. And typically they're going to be more expensive than your salt blocks, but you're also getting a lot more for your dollar in terms of supplemental need. Okay, in the interest of time, we're going to just talk about body condition scoring briefly, but I won't go real deep into that. But body condition scoring is a measure of body fat stores available as an energy source. The scoring ranges are going to be from 1 to being very thin and 9 to being obese. I'm actually in the process of finishing up a fact sheet that we'll have on our website here in the not too distant future that addresses this issue. But it's a way of trying to objectively measure how much fat an animal is carrying, so we have a good idea what energy reserves are. Areas that were really key to look at are going to be in the tail head right here. The pins and the hooks were right in here. You're going to be looking at the ribs and also fat in the shoulder. But I would say these areas right here are the most telling on a cow when we're trying to determine her body condition score. Now, I have a video here, but in the interest of time, it's about a 7-minute video. It's embedded and it will be embedded in this when I put it online, so you can play it. But we're not going to go through that today in the interest of time. Okay, so I just want to talk a little bit about the effects of body condition score and why it's important. There's a really strong relationship between body condition score, calving, and reproductive success. Been a lot of research done with that. As I mentioned earlier, cows need to conceive 80 to 85 days post-calving in order to maintain that postpartum interval. So this is a research study done in Oklahoma showing that cows that were calved in a body condition score of less than 4 are only bred at a 60% rate. If they were condition score 5, we were at 80%, and greater than 6, they were at in the 90% range. And so big difference here. Again, this goes back to when we talked about the importance of having cows in condition in period 1 when they calve. It's really critical to get a good body condition at that time. A little more information I can show you. This is another study also done in Oklahoma, if I remember correctly. But this is a study that looked at first calf heifers, looking at body condition score at calving. And then what they did with these animals is they had a set that were body condition score 5 at calving, represented by the orange and purple lines. With one set of heifers, they supplemented them after calving. The other set that they just kept them in a maintenance mode and just tried to maintain their body condition. And then you've got another set of heifers represented by the red and green lines that were less than condition score 5 at calving. And with the red line, they supplemented the cattle to try to get them back in shape, and the green line was 36. And I think the take-home message here is that if cows calve in good condition, regardless if you supplement them to maintain condition or not, they're going to breed back pretty well. In this case, 94 and 91%. They did a little better if we try to improve their condition, but in any event, they bred pretty well. If they calve in poor condition, your red and your green lines, you can try to feed them back into shape, but you're going to have subpar results at the end. So again, body condition score at calving is really, really critical. All right, so looking at some potential feeding strategies. If we think our assumption being an April 1 calving day, we're going to assume those cattle are out on the range on a grazing permit from the 15th of May to the 15th of October, and that they can graze some kind of crop aftermath in the fall. I know that is not every scenario, but I think it's a pretty common scenario in Utah. Utilized in the same production cycle we talked about earlier. So looking at the 4 stages of production, as I mentioned, period 1, bull to turnout, period 2, or calving to turnout, period 2 is breeding to lactating, period 3 is pregnant, not lactating, and then period 4 is just before calving. So we're going to start in period 3, and that's kind of, to me, when the new year begins, so to speak. And as I mentioned earlier, this is just the best time to put weight back on cows. So if we add just a little bit of protein and increase diet matter intake, at this point, it goes a long ways in improving their body condition. So cattle are going to be grazing dormant range from November in December. Supplement in the form of tubs or blocks. If accessibility or labor is an issue, you can put, if you're looking at an environment like this and you want those cattle to spread out and utilize range, the tubs and the blocks can work out really well. Or another option would be to feed about 4.5 pounds of 20% alfalfa hay about 3 times a week. So you got there 3 times a week, you kind of move the cows a little bit around with where you supplement them. And that will provide about 4/10 of a pound of added protein every day. So either one of these, depending on what cost scenario works best, can work at this time. And typically you're going to want a free choice mineral. I would think at this time it's about 8% phosphorus. The phosphorus level really determines the price of your loose mineral. The higher it is, the higher the price. And the higher the animal's overall requirements when they're on dormant forage or low quality forage, they're going to need a little higher phosphorus levels. Jumping on to period 4, back to the 60 days before calving, where I'm assuming in this case your cattle are all condition score 5 or better and look something like these cows, and we want to maintain their body weight. So we can feed a lower quality grass, hay or straw even, and supplement those animals with a little bit of alfalfa. You can feed it daily, or you can say for about 3 pounds a day, or feed it 3 to 5 times a week if you wanted to be able to cut your labor cost a little bit. And I think what's important in this scenario is that we just need to be prepared as a producer to be watching the weather and to be able to feed a little bit more when cattle are in extreme weather conditions. Again, I think a free choice 8% phosphorus mineral will work pretty good in this scenario as well. Periods 1 and 2, I got them here together. April 1st to into June, be 0 to 90 days post calving. And so we're looking at April 1 to say May 15th. We're going to feed a higher quality grass hay early in this period if we don't have a range to go to. 4 to 5 pounds of alfalfa fed every day. So their requirements are obviously they've gone up, but we can feed a little higher quality grass and some alfalfa. And again, that 8% phosphorus mineral can work pretty good. And then from the 15th of May until they go out in June, or 15th of May through June, we're going to be out on a grazing permit during that time. You don't need as much phosphorus in your mineral. We're going to assume our grazing permit and the grass on their native range is taking care of those cows. And then July through October, kind of same story. We should have adequate forage quality. We're going to be pulling the bulls out at some point in this time, and just a free choice sort of fortified salt block will fit their needs pretty well here. So I just want to give some examples of the different periods and what they look like. All right, quickly, just a couple notes and comments on weaning calves. A suckling, if you've got a cow, or on calves in general, a suckling calf, typically in most situations, if you're taking care of the cow, she's going to take care of the calf. I'd say there are times when it may pay to try to supplement the calves directly, but oftentimes that can be impractical logistically, and it isn't always practical cost-wise. But taking care of that cow, she'll take care of the calf. Calves will consume mineral and supplemental feed, so you need to kind of figure that in if you're supplying mineral supplemental feed. And I say the mineral especially is going to be important as they get their immune system ready for the challenges they're going to face during weaning, and that's kind of mentioned here. The vitamin and mineral nutrition are really important for health and optimal growth. I've seen in my career many times where you have a good healthy cow, or where the calves are good and healthy while they're on the cow and completely fall apart at weaning. That can be a lot of different factors that can cause that. But oftentimes an animal may be getting good enough mineral supplementation to stay healthy on the cow, but you could have some antagonisms there that are interfering with copper and zinc absorption. Could be high iron or sulfates, could be high molybdenum, whatever it might be, and also interfering with selenium absorption that can really affect the immune system. So understanding what this is and having a good mineral program on the cow can help that calf be more prepared. If you do have some of these problems, the chelated or organic trace minerals can help with some of these deficiencies. But again, you need to probably get it through the cow and let the calf have access while they're on the cow. Energy and protein deficiency, if you're dealing with that kind of situation with a suckling calf, it may be more efficient way to try to feed the calf directly. And you can do that really in a couple of different ways. One would be creep feeding, which is probably pretty impractical in a lot of range situations, or in severe situations or drought. It's probably not a bad idea just to wean the calves early, to give your cows a break and also be able to direct your resources straight into that calf and get them healthy with some protein and energy. Weaning time, just some thoughts on vaccination. In a perfect world, I think it's great, obviously, to vaccinate the calves at branding. And then if you can, 2 to 3 weeks before weaning is really nice to do. That allows a calf to be able to respond to that vaccine without having to stress a weaning. Again, I know in some range situations, this is not practical, but where it is, I think it's a good idea to be able to do it. You want to avoid additional processing at weaning time if you can when you're vaccinating them. So it's a good idea to have dehorning already done. Good idea to have castration already done. Done at branding if it's possible while that calf is still on the cow and she can take care of them. Doing these two things at weaning puts a lot of stress on the animal. If you have to do it, then you do, but this certainly should be avoided. Deworming, this gets a question, especially in the West. A lot of people don't think you have big worm loads. My opinion would be that in a weaning program, especially if you're ever a producer that's going to wean the calves themselves and maybe put them in a backgrounding program, I would definitely deworm calves. Others, even if they're carrying a light worm load, it's not worth any detriment it might have to performance not to deworm those calves at that point in time. It's also helpful to feed, if you can, feed calves with the cows prior to weaning if possible. That kind of acclimates them to some new feed. So if you're, depending on when your cows are born, they may have never seen hay or any other type of supplemental feed. So having them figure that out just to let mama show them how that this is a good thing to eat can be really help with the weaning process. Some different weaning methods. We want to avoid dust and wean on a pasture if you can. That isn't always possible, but it certainly is more desirable. You can just take the calves off the cows, which this is probably the most common, would just be abrupt removal. If you're doing that, it's better to leave the calves where they're at and remove the cows out of sight and earshot of the calves if you can. Because what's going to happen, a lot of you may know this, but calves will tend to go back to where they were last with their mother. And so if you leave the calf where their mother was, they're more likely, they're going to go looking for her. There's no doubt about that. But they may wander a little bit less if you can take the cows away from the calves as opposed to vice versa. One thing that I've seen work really good is what's called fence lining weaning. And that's removing the cows from the calves, but they're just across the fence from each other. Requires a good fence. That's not always an option in some cases, but that really reduces the stress of weaning. And in a lot of cases, after those cows are kind of done, after they've been relieved a little bit from having that tight bag, they'll just wander off and do their own thing. And the same thing with the calves. They figure out their mama's there. They didn't really need to milk all that bad anyway. In a lot of cases, it's really more a matter for company that can make this really less stressful. You may want to use a hot wire inside your fence as well to keep them apart. And about 5 to 7 days will typically do it. I've seen this work really good in improving health. So if it's an option, it's certainly something to consider. The other thing I've seen in a practical sense in this process, I'll just throw out to y'all if you are working with anybody that's doing this, is if they get one cow on the wrong side of the fence or one calf on the wrong side of the fence, don't stress it. If you're in there chasing them around all the time because one calf keeps crawling through, I would just leave them. The rest of the cattle will wean better. And then when you take the cows away, just pull that calf off or pull the cow out or whatever it might be, rather than trying to have a perfect fence line weaning scenario. Okay, a couple quick more things. The water, we've already talked about water, but even more important in a weaning scenario, it needs to be clean, it needs to be easy to get to. Consider the fact that calves may have never drink water out of a water tank or a water trough of any sort. If they've always always drink water, live water. I've seen scenarios where cattle would have water in the pen right there 20, 30 feet away and never drink out of a water tank. One scenario was with a set of bulls that went, I was called into the situation a couple days after because these bulls weren't eating. It was 90 plus degrees. They would not eat their feed. There was water in both fence lines in a feed yard scenario, and those bulls would have died from a lack of water, of dehydration, if we had not gone into the pen, pulled the plug out of the pen, let the water run, and the bulls went run into the water. So to think they can smell water is not accurate, and everybody thinks that they're more intuitive than sometimes they really are. Now that's the exception and not the rule, but it's also something not to forget about when you're providing water to calves that have never seen a water tank. Another way you can overcome that is to hook a hose to the valve on your tank and let it run into the tank so they can hear it and see that water running in and making the kind of noise they're used to seeing. That can also help. All right. Won't go too deep into the feed side. I'm not going to try to do any rations or anything here today, but your feed quality really matters. And part of the reason for that is sometimes these calves don't eat much when they're first being weaned. So you got to make every bite count. It needs to be fairly energy dense. When you're feeding hay in a scenario, if you can, feed them hay that's palatable, but also something familiar to them. Depending on the part of the country you're in, if those calves have never seen alfalfa hay, oftentimes a good quality grass hay will be a little bit better getting them to figure out how to eat hay and eat the feed bunk because grass is more familiar than alfalfa, even though alfalfa can be higher in energy content. If they've eaten alfalfa before, it's a non-issue. I typically would avoid silage with new calf diets because that can be unless they're familiar with it, can be kind of a smell and a texture that they might avoid at first, and you can introduce it later once they get used to eating feed. I like to provide a free choice palatable mineral, have extra vitamin and trace mineral fortification, including the chelates or organic trace minerals, and then introduce new feeds with the hay within 2 or 3 days. And you can feed a mixed ration or a pelleted feed, but initially you just want them to come up to eat whatever it is you want them to feed them with, whether it's in a feed buck or not. So giving them something familiar that will have them calm and quiet makes a big difference. Some health concerns with weaning would be coccidiosis, which is a bloody scours. And the coccidia are really present with the cattle all the time. It's in their digestive system, but it's stress that brings it out. So really any kind of ration or supplement that you give weaned calf should contain some kind of a coccidiostat. These are some products on the market that would be considered a coccidiostat. It would be Decox, Bovatec to a lesser degree, and Rumensin all can control coccidiosis. Not great treatments if you have a problem already, but they can help prevent it. And then you can use an amprolium product, which can be used in the water, and that's both prevention and treatment. There's also a feed grade product of amprolium as well, but this coccidiosis is a pretty common health concern. The other one would be any kind of respiratory disease. And really, as far as prevention is the best way to go with this. So good pre-weaning nutrition and vaccination program, as we've talked about already. And then other preventive options can be a prophylactic antibiotic treatment or a mass treatment with injectables given at weaning, or you can use some feed grade antibiotics as well. Keeping in mind that in this day that we're in now, pretty well all of these antibiotic treatments are going to require veterinary prescription. So you need to have a client-patient relationship with a veterinarian. And that covers it for today. I'm going to go ahead and let's see.